Tehran was jolted awake before dawn this week by explosions that felt different from everything that came before them. For more than 2 weeks now, American strikes on Iran had mostly stayed close to the coast. Port cities, islands in the Strait of Hormuz, radar sites and missile depots along the Gulf. This time the fighting reached further inland, into the districts that make up the beating administrative heart of the country. And residents across the capital described being startled out of sleep by blasts on opposite sides of the city at once. Hess Central Command confirmed the strikes plainly, saying its forces had hit Iranian command centers, air defense sites, missile and drone capabilities, and coastal surveillance facilities using precision munitions against targets in multiple locations, including the southern port of Bandar Abbas. That's the official language, and it's worth being precise about what it actually says. It confirms command centers were struck somewhere in Iran. It does not name Tehran specifically as a target, and it doesn't identify any particular building inside the capital. Separately, Iranian state media reported that air defenses had been activated in the capital overnight to counter what officials called enemy reconnaissance activity. And residents described hearing loud explosions. Those two things happened on the same night. Whether they're directly connected in the way the more dramatic headlines are already suggesting is something worth treating carefully, rather than assuming. This is the point in the story where a lot of coverage starts filling gaps with certainty it doesn't actually have. So let's not do that. Here's what's genuinely confirmed, and here's what remains reported but unverified, because the distinction matters more than making the story sound as dramatic as possible. What's confirmed is the human toll. Iran's Ministry of Health said this week that at least 35 people have been killed and more than 300 injured since this latest round of fighting resumed roughly 2 weeks ago. That's a number from Iran's own health authorities, not a wartime propaganda claim from either side's military spokesperson, and it deserves to be treated with the same weight as any other sourced casualty figure in this conflict. On the American side, the Pentagon has said nearly 100 U.S. service members have suffered injuries, mostly minor, since fighting resumed in early July, with a small number of confirmed deaths that Trump has publicly said Iran will pay for. Also confirmed, this specific run of strikes is now well into its second week, with CENTCOM describing consecutive nights of attacks aimed at degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Earlier in the week, American forces conducted a 90-minute strike wave against coastal defense and cruise missile positions on Greater Tumb Island, one of several small Gulf islands Iranian officials have long referred to as the country's stationary, unsinkable aircraft carriers, positions used to threaten shipping lanes rather than defend Iranian territory directly. Those islands have increasingly become exposed, hard to resupply outposts rather than defensible assets, and this week's strikes there fit a pattern that's been building for months. On the Iranian side, the IRGC has claimed a series of counterstrikes against American positions across the Gulf, missile and drone attacks aimed at U.S. military sites in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan, including a claim that Iranian forces destroyed an American command and control center and a fighter jet storage facility at a base in Jordan using ballistic missiles. Those are Iranian claims, reported by Iranian state and IRGC-linked media, and as with most single-source battlefield claims from either side in this war, they're worth holding as reported rather than settled until there's independent confirmation. What is independently documented is that Gulf states have been intercepting incoming fire. Kuwait has reported intercepting hostile targets, sirens have sounded in Bahrain, and Jordan has said it shot down Iranian missiles headed its way. Now, the economic front, because this is where the war's financial pressure and its military pressure are colliding most directly. American forces have continued enforcing pressure around Karg Island, Iran's primary crude oil export terminal, a facility that handles the overwhelming majority of the country's oil exports to international markets. Reports from earlier in the campaign describe explosions on Karg Island itself, alongside strikes on Bandar Abbas and Keshem Island. And the Trump administration has paired the military pressure with economic pressure directly, reimposing sanctions on Iranian oil sales in response to attacks on commercial shipping. Read that again. Sanctions and airstrikes moving together, aimed at the same target: Iran's ability to fund its own war effort through oil revenue. CENTCOM has also disclosed a detail that's easy to miss inside all the strike reporting, but says something real about the war's other purpose. Since early May, CENTCOM says its forces have helped facilitate the transit of approximately 900 commercial vessels and 450 million barrels of crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz. That's the framing Washington keeps returning to. This isn't just a campaign against Iran's military, it's an ongoing effort to keep one of the world's most critical oil choke points open. And every strike gets justified publicly in exactly those terms. Let's talk about the platforms, because understanding the hardware explains what's operationally different about this phase of the war, while being honest about where confirmed fact ends and informed inference begins. CENTCOM, as a matter of standard practice, doesn't typically confirm which specific aircraft or munitions were used in any individual strike. What can be said is that reaching targets deep in Iran's interior, beyond the coastal zone where earlier strikes concentrated, requires long-range standoff capability, aircraft and missiles that can hit a target from well outside the reach of Iran's remaining air defense systems, rather than needing to fly directly over the target itself. That's the kind of capability the U.S. has spent years refining specifically for scenarios like this one, and it's consistent with the pattern residents describe. Sudden explosions with little or no warning, rather than an extended period of visible aircraft activity beforehand. And hovering over every conversation about where this war goes next is a single aircraft and weapon combination that hasn't yet been used in this specific war. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, carrying the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, reserved, according to Trump's own repeated public statements, for Pickaxe Mountain, the deeply fortified underground facility near Iran's Natanz nuclear site. The B-2 can fly directly from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, penetrate contested airspace using its stealth profile, deliver the 30,000-pound bomb against deeply buried, hardened targets, and return home without needing to be based anywhere in the region. None of that means a strike on Pickaxe Mountain is imminent or decided. It means the specific tool built for exactly that job is sitting ready, and the president has said, in his own words, that it's coming. It's worth stepping back and looking at the shape of this campaign's targeting progression because the sequence itself tells a story. The earliest nights of this renewed fighting focused on coastal radar, fast attack boats, and missile storage tied directly to the strait. Later nights hit forward island positions. After that came sensor networks and communications infrastructure, the connective tissue linking Iran's dispersed forces to central coordination, now command centers. That's not necessarily proof of a rigid plan laid out from day one, but it does reflect a logical military sequence. It's harder to strike command infrastructure effectively before degrading the air defenses protecting the approach, and harder to degrade those defenses before disrupting the systems coordinating them. Why does targeting command and control, specifically, matter more than just destroying missiles or boats one at a time? Because a functioning military command structure does several things simultaneously. It turns scattered sensor and radar data into coherent targeting decisions. It connects political leadership to the people actually operating weapons. And it lets an organization calibrate its own response deliberately, rather than leaving individual units to act on their own judgment. When that structure degrades, whether through direct strikes on command nodes or through the kind of institutional strain already visible in Iran's leadership, the weapons underneath it don't necessarily disappear. And what changes is whether their use still reflects a coherent decision made at the top, or increasingly reflects the judgment of whoever happens to be holding launch authority in a given province on a given night. That's a genuinely more dangerous and less predictable situation for everyone, including the United States and its Gulf partners, than a war run by a single, deliberate adversary. Iran's public signaling this week has been genuinely contradictory, and that contradiction is itself informative. Even as this round of strikes has intensified, back-channel diplomacy involving regional intermediaries has continued in the background. The same kind of channel that has periodically produced humanitarian gestures and communication between Washington and Tehran at earlier points in this conflict, including the Memorandum of Understanding both sides signed back in June. At the same time, Iran's foreign ministry has said it has no plans for negotiation. The IRGC has continued striking at Gulf shipping and U.S. positions, and Iranian military officials have publicly warned that Iran's response could exceed what its adversaries expect, potentially opening new fronts entirely. That combination, quiet diplomatic gestures running alongside public threats of escalation, reads less like a single coordinated strategy and more like what you'd expect from a government whose internal coordination has been genuinely strained. On the specific question of unused Iranian capability, it's worth being precise about what that phrase can and can't mean. Iran likely retains mobile ballistic missile systems dispersed across its interior, positions that are inherently harder for coastal-focused strike packages to locate than fixed coastal and island facilities. Mobile systems don't emit the same persistent radar signatures as fixed installations, and they can reposition between launches, making them meaningfully more survivable. That's a real threat category still on the table. But unused isn't automatically the same as strategically preserved. Some of what looks like reserved capability from outside may simply be capability that isn't currently employable, because supporting infrastructure has been destroyed, because coordination has degraded, or because Iran's leadership hasn't yet decided the escalation risk is worth it. Telling the difference from outside Iran's own command structure is genuinely difficult, and it's worth resisting the pull toward the more dramatic interpretation by default. There's also a broader question about what pressure like this creates inside Iran itself. The country's institutional command structure shows visible signs of strain, and its leadership has remained largely out of public view since the war's opening strike back in February, when a coordinated U.S.-Israeli operation killed Iran's supreme leader, along with a significant number of senior military and government officials. His successor was installed within roughly a week, and multiple accounts describe his actual role since then as largely ceremonial. legitimizing decisions made elsewhere rather than directing policy himself, with real operational authority resting instead with IRGC leadership and a narrowing circle around Iran's Supreme National Security Council. That fractured structure predates this week's command center strikes. What those strikes appear to be doing now is degrading the physical infrastructure, the communications and coordination systems that let a fractured leadership still function as something resembling a government. Remove that coordination architecture entirely, and what's left isn't a unified government issuing contradictory statements for strategic reasons. It's several separate centers of power, each managing its own version of the crisis, increasingly disconnected from each other in practice as well as in structure. There's a domestic political dimension in Washington worth folding into this picture too, because it shapes how much runway exists for a campaign that keeps expanding in scope. Earlier this summer, both chambers of a Republican-controlled Congress passed war powers resolutions, directing the president to end hostilities with Iran, a largely symbolic but historically rare bipartisan rebuke that Trump publicly dismissed. Polling around the same period found only a minority of Americans felt the war had been worth its cost. A campaign that keeps moving from coastal infrastructure toward command centers, and that the president himself has repeatedly linked to a potential strike on Iran's most fortified nuclear facility, is unfolding against a backdrop of real domestic skepticism rather than unified political support, even within Trump's own party. That doesn't appear to be slowing the campaign down. But it does mean the pressure shaping these decisions isn't purely military. Israel's posture remains an important variable that hasn't fully resolved either. Israeli officials have said in recent weeks that Israel is prepared to resume direct strikes on Iran if called on to, warning any renewed involvement would come with greater force than in previous rounds this year. Israel hasn't formally rejoined the fighting as of this week, but the American campaign's expansion into Iran's interior and command infrastructure is exactly the kind of development that could shift that calculation, particularly if the next phase moves toward Pickaxe Mountain specifically, a target Israel has treated as a core national security priority for years, independent of whatever Washington ultimately decides. It's worth going deeper on why Pickaxe Mountain keeps sitting at the center of every conversation about this war's next phase, because it connects directly to what already happened to Iran's nuclear program once before. During the opening phase of this war back in the spring, the United States struck Iran's underground nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan using the same GBU-57 bunker buster bombs now reportedly reserved for Pickaxe Mountain, a strike Trump characterized at the time as a limited one-off mission. A preliminary intelligence assessment, one the administration characterized as a politically motivated leak, concluded those earlier strikes hadn't actually collapsed the underground facilities and had likely set Iran's weapons capability back by months rather than years, in part because Iran appeared to have relocated much of its enriched uranium stockpile before the bombs landed. Iran's declared stockpile of uranium enriched to near weapons-grade levels is believed to have survived that round largely intact, buried under rubble rather than destroyed by it. Pickaxe Mountain is the far more deeply fortified facility built in response, one that American analysts have assessed sits below the reach of even the most powerful conventional bunker busters currently in the arsenal. Put all of this together, and the honest picture right now is of a war that has genuinely deepened over the past 2 weeks. It has expanded from coastal and maritime targets into Iran's interior command infrastructure, enforced a blockade around Iran's most important oil export terminal, and continued doing all of that while Iran's own public messaging shows visible signs of internal contradiction rather than coordinated strategy. What isn't confirmed, and shouldn't be presented as though it were, is the most cinematic version of the past week's events, a precisely targeted decapitation strike on a named building using named platforms and named munitions. What's actually confirmed is more measured, and in its own way still serious enough to matter on its own terms. Command centers struck somewhere in Iran, Tehran's air defenses activating in a city that had largely been spared direct fighting until recently, and a death toll that Iran's own health ministry now puts at 35 confirmed and rising. More than 2 weeks into this renewed phase of a war that first began with the killing of a sitting head of state back in February, this stretch of fighting represents something genuinely different in kind, not just in degree. Every prior phase, however intense, stayed largely within a boundary both sides seemed to implicitly understand. Coastal infrastructure, shipping lanes, missile depots, the machinery of the conflict rather than the machinery of the state itself. Command centers, wherever exactly they were hit, sit on the other side of that line. So does the prospect, named publicly and repeatedly by the president himself, of a strike on the single most fortified nuclear facility Iran possesses. None of that guarantees a clean, decisive outcome in either direction. Iran's leadership structure was already fractured before this latest round of strikes began, and further degrading its coordination capacity could just as easily produce a more dangerous, less predictable adversary as a weaker one. Missiles fired by provincial commanders with less central oversight, rather than fewer missiles fired overall. Whatever comes next, whether that's a strike on the mountain Trump keeps naming publicly, a slower continuation of exactly this pattern, or some diplomatic off-ramp still being quietly worked through the same channels that have periodically kept communication alive, even through the worst stretches of this war, the honest read tonight is simple. This conflict has moved measurably closer to Iran's political and military center of gravity. And neither government currently shows any sign of treating that as a turning point, rather than simply the next step in an escalation that hasn't yet found its ceiling.